Now then, Arachnid, any last words?
Humana comes to mind.
The Sinister Six are not only Spider-Man's deadliest matchup, but also are one of the most well-known villain teams in all of comic book history. A team built on combining multiple power sets to make a collection of considerably lesser villains into a unstoppable threat. Which reminds me of the whole team-up mechanic in Marvel Rivals. You guys really seemed to love my X-Men pitch video, so I thought why not have some fun and welcome the Sinister Six to Marvel Rivals. So, I want to just start off saying I don't actually think the Sinister Six should really be added, or at least they shouldn't be added anytime soon. On top of this, we recently discovered a lot more information, and before I actually planned this video, on how seasons are going to work. It looks like for the future we're going to be getting about 2 characters a season, and so a team of 6 would never get added anyway. But I do feel the game is really lacking on the villain side when it comes to the roster. And whilst I don't think padding it with just Spider-Man villains is a solution, I do think we need more villains in general. This game is a celebration of all things Marvel, and really, 6 characters from one guy's rogues gallery is a bit much, but Marvel Comics have some amazing villains, and I'd love to see them in the game. That being said, I'm not a Marvel's dev. I'm not even that high ranked in the game, but this is for fun, so screw it, and I'm gonna pitch my favourite villain team. And it just so happens to be made up of Spider-Man bad guys. Now, this is just part 1, and I'm gonna break down the first 3 members of the Sinister Six and their abilities. And then in part 2, I'll show you the other half of the team. I've also split the 6, coincidentally, into a 2-2-2 comp. Not really intentional, it just kind of worked out that way. But that means we'll be looking at a strategist, a vanguard, and a duelist in both videos. With that being said, there's a bunch to go over, so let's get into the first member of the team. Their leader, an insane genius, Otto Octavius.
The power of the sun in the palm of my hand.
Dr. Otto Octavius, aka Doc Ock or Dr. Octopus, is arguably in the running for the title of Spider-Man's arch nemesis. He's had a rivalry with him since the very beginning of Peter's career, and it's evolved more intricately than pretty much any of Peter's other foes. Now, Ock has been a hero at times. On 2 occasions he was superior Spider-Man, and on 1 he was superior Octopus. But I want to pull more from the classic era of the character, a genius roboticist who improves villains to further his evil plot. That being said, let's get into his kit. Now, Doc Ock will be the first strategist of this list, and with that being said, he's going to be focused on dishing out heals and slight buffs and protection to his allies, whilst attacking anyone who bothers to try and get close to him. He's going to have a bit of defensive capability on himself, but he's mostly all about making sure he's always in the fight, giving out his healing abilities. Let's just start with his basic attack, which are the robot tentacles. Now, these are somewhat similar to Venom's tentacles, in a sense that each of the 4 tentacles deal a small amount of damage, but if more hit one enemy, then that enemy is taking more damage because there's more tentacles hitting them. However, unlike Venom, these have a sort of auto-aim effect, kind of reminiscent of Cloak's fog ability and Scarlet's basic attack. So the way that this would work with Doc Ock is he would have a small radius around himself, and whenever an enemy is within that radius and Doc Ock is using his primary fire, the tentacles will auto-aim on that enemy. Now, they have no critical damage because of this, but, you know, they still deal constant damage each tentacle hitting them. As more enemies enter this radius, the tentacles split apart and target individual enemies, up to a max of 4 enemies. The more enemies, the less damage each enemy is taking because the tentacles aren't hitting the same person multiple times. This I wanted to incorporate mainly as a reference to the fact that, especially ever since the Raimi films, there's been this sort of common idea that the tentacles have a mind of their own. Now, this isn't innately a thing that really is to do with Doc Ock. It's really more of a movie trope. But I like it, and I wanted to incorporate it somehow into this kit. So the idea that the tentacles have their own little AI that auto-tracks, I think is really fun. But that is just his base attack, and being a strategist, he's going to be quite dependent on his cooldowns. So let's just dive right ahead into those. Nanite gas. This is one of Doc Ock's main forms of healing. This would do a bulk heal in one area, but it is on cooldown. So the way nanite gas works is it's kind of like a grenade that Doc throws, and it would create a smoke screen very reminiscent of Punisher's smoke bombs, and all allies within this smoke screen receive healing. But of course, with it being a smokescreen, it does block line of sight from your enemies. It would also mean your allies who are your side of the smokescreen won't be able to see through it. So you kind of have to know when to throw it and where to throw it. But it does mean you can just sort of fog up the battlefield whilst healing your allies. That being said, the nanite gas is not Doc Ock's primary ability. His primary sort of core focus is on his Octobots, which are little robots that Doc Ock invented in the comic books. It's a shame we've never really seen them in the films. They're kind of a core staple of the character, and I feel like they haven't been done quite the justice they do deserve. But the way the Octobots work in this game is they attach to allies. So Doc Ock can either directly attach them to an ally if an ally's within range, or if there's no allies within range, when he presses the ability button, the Octobot will drop to the floor and scuttle to the nearest ally. Once an Octobot is attached to an ally, it will begin to slowly heal them. This is Doc Ock's primary main focus on how he heals all his allies. Basically, it's just going to be constantly pumping in slow heals. Now, the Octobots do have an incredibly small health bar, and while attached to an ally, they will take damage instead of that ally. So if you attach this onto an ally who's in the middle of gunfire, the Octobot probably isn't going to get much healing done, but it will block a tiny bit of that damage. Really what you want to do is get these Octobots in between fights to heal your allies up, and then when an ult is coming down, the Octobot would block that ult instead of your ally taking the hit. That brings us over to Doc Ock's third and final cooldown. Now, this is a cooldown I originally had a completely different power set for, but after reading the comments of last video, I was inspired to change it into what I'm going to be explaining in a moment. To give you guys an idea of what I originally wanted, it was the cloning station. This is based on the idea that after the Spider-Verse and Spider-Geddon sort of storylines, and after Superior Spider-Man storyline as well, Doc Ock had invented cloning stations that mean if he ever dies or anything happens to his body, he can have a new body back at his base. So the idea here this would work as a respawn anchor for the whole team. It would have a limited number of uses before it destroys itself, and your team would still have to sit through the respawn counter, but once that's done, they respawn at your cloning station instead of at the normal spawn. So it's kind of like a BRB, but with more uses, but it isn't instant. Now, instead, after reading the comments from last video, I thought, what about it has an unlimited number of uses, but it exclusively affects Doc Ock? So basically what it now does is it's a small little device that has a health bar, enemies can destroy it, but whenever Doc dies, instead of respawning at the spawn, he respawns at his cloning station, basically just bringing him back immediately into the fray. Now, Doc Ock would be able to destroy this whenever he wants. In the case of push maps, you're really going to want to get rid of them once you go past it and it's further away than your own spawn. But when it comes to balancing that, the cooldown for this ability would be quite long, and it wouldn't actually start until the device is destroyed. So you couldn't wait for your cooldown to finish and then destroy it and immediately place a new one. You'd have to wait for it to be broken, then wait the cooldown out, then you can place yourself a new cloning station. And with that note, we move on to Doc Ock's passives. He only has one, and that is octopedal mobility. This basically is the same wall climb ability that half the roster seem to get. Doc Ock does have a slight difference in that he can't attack while he wall climbs. This is mainly just because the tentacles are climbing and they're his primary fire. But it just gives him a bit of mobility, lets him get out of fights and sort of get to new angles where he can throw down his Octobots or maybe hide his cloning station. Then we get Doc's Alt. Doc Ock is a super genius, and because of this, he plans for every possible twist and turn in his missions. That's exactly what this ultimate is. Doc Ock has the ult Mastermind, where when you activate it, Doc Ock reveals that he has planted 5 Octobots on his allies. Basically, instantly, all 5 of your allies gain an Octobot. This Octobot continues to heal them like it normally would, but it also has a few changes. For a short period of time, Octobots no longer take any damage for your allies. So they don't save your allies, they don't block anything for them. But they also have no health bar to kill themselves with. So your Octobots are permanently locked onto the ally for this short period of time. In addition, they also provide a small damage boost. Now, the damage boost provided by the Octobots wouldn't be anywhere near as powerful as, say, Rocket or Luna's ult, nor would the healing be as good as Luna's ult. Instead, you're getting a little bit of both at the same time. This also means that all of your allies now have Octobots on them, so when the time period ends, those Octobots remain. Now, when the time period does end, those Octobots do go back to taking damage for your allies and not giving a damage boost. And then as for the 5th Octobot, I haven't really decided fully. It would either be randomly chosen and then be destroyed, or just for a period of time after the ult, you have 5 Octobots out. Once you place a new one, or once it is destroyed, you just go back to having a cap of 4. I think keeping it at now having 5 after the ult does have a nice little bonus that your ult is making sure your whole team is covered with Octobots for a short while. And that sort of finishes off Doc Ock's base kit. Now, we do have his team-up abilities, but overall, his kit is really centered around getting those Octobots onto people, maneuvering yourself with your mobility, and then just trying to use that auto-aim to keep enemies off you while you're pumping out those gas grenades. As for his team-up abilities, we have Sinister Designs, which is his Sinister Six team ability, where he will team up with the other 2 characters I'm covering in this video, and I will explain exactly what that team ability does at the end of the video. You'll notice it on both of the other villains we're going to be talking about. But as for Doc Ock's team ability that I will be explaining, that is Superior Spider. This is a team ability he gets with Spider-Man. Now, I really wanted to avoid giving the Sinister Six Spider-Man themed team-up abilities. I feel like it's just too obvious, and I would like to have fun figuring out other team abilities they could do. But for Ock, I did think he deserved the spot for the Spider-Man team ability, and it is the Sinister Six, so at least one person should get it. That being said, Superior Spider is titled so because of that time when Doc Ock was Superior Spider-Man. And during that time period in the comic books, Doc Ock used his Octobots to create Spider-Bots, which Spider-Man still has, I believe, to this day in the comics. If he doesn't, he had them for a while at least. These are little drones that are like Octobots, but they're spider-themed. Doc Ock, in this case, would be the anchor for the team, meaning he himself doesn't really get anything other than a seasonal bonus, but Spidey would get something in the form of Spider-Bots. Basically, Spider-Bots are exactly the same as Octobots, only Spidey can apply them to himself instead of allies. What this essentially means is if you have Doc Ock, Spider-Man on the same team, everyone on the team except Ock himself can have an Octobot or Spider-Bot attached to them, because Spidey brings that 5th one into the game. But that was Dr. Octavius, and now we're ready to move on to our next character. A huntsman of sorts, who is so skilled in his craft, he was even able to outwit Spider-Man's very own spider sense. This is a hero who can track any foe he needs and secure the perfect hunt. Kraven the Huntsman.
Grow slow in your old age, Sergei. A fate you will not share. I've been in your shadow for hours, but you sense nothing. Pathetic.
When it comes to Kravinoff, I really wanted to invoke the idea of embarking on a hunt every time you leave spawn. This is a character who picks a foe, tracks them down, wounds them, and finally completes the kill, all before moving on to his next prey. So I think it's really only right that he will be the first duelist of our Sinister Six. Kraven's kit is really about picking your enemies out, weakening them, and then securing a 1v1 where you have all of the possible advantages. So, let's just dive right into his kit, which begins with his basic attacks and weapons. That's right, plural. Kraven, much like Punisher, Black Widow, and Rocket, has two types of weapons which he can switch between on the go. It's less like Rocket in the sense of being multi-trigger, it's more like Black Widow and Punisher's ability to press a button and swap what weapon they're holding. His primary starting weapon is his tranquilizer rifle, if I can say it right, which is a long-range rifle that comes with a scope, and when it hits an enemy, it applies a slowed condition to them. Now, unlike Black Widow, this would be a low-damaging rifle. It wouldn't be used for just on its own picking off people, unless you can see there's damaged foes and you just want to finish them off. More so be used for your setup and applying that slowdown condition. Which brings us over to Kraven's second weapon, his vibranium knives. Now these would be a melee weapon. They would work much like all the other melee attackers in the game, but these deal fairly high damage. The idea is you slow someone down with the rifle, and then using his cooldowns, you make your way in, and then you start using those knives to finish off the enemy. But speaking of the cooldowns, I think it's really important we just get straight into them, because Kraven has two, and they are essential to how his kit functions. The first one is Jungle Pounce. This is an air dive he can do while in the air. It's only available when he's in the air, so if he's on the ground he can't use this dash ability, but it would be mostly focusable for his mobility and less so on the damage output. Think more like Psylocke's dash, less like Black Panther's. Now, talking of Black Panther, there is a second thing him and Kraven share in common. They will also both have a spear. Kraven's spear is the hunting spear. This is a powerful spear shot that, when thrown at an enemy, will apply knockback, and if that enemy is knocked into a wall or object, it will pin them temporarily. So, I do know that this sounds extremely similar to Black Panther's kit, but I want to preface by saying these are mainly visual similarities, and in gameplay they will differ quite a lot. Black Panther is all about getting those spear throws off into dashes to sort of set up combos where you do these complicated movesets that secure kills on most enemies in the game, whereas Kraven is more about setup with your rifle and then maybe with your spear to set up, using the dash as a mobility to secure distance since you start off so far away, and then mainly just going in for basic melee attacks to finish your enemies off. Now, when it comes to the sort of distance and the perches that Kraven's going to be using, we need to take into consideration how he's going to get there and how he's going to be aware of his surroundings. And that's exactly where his two passives come in. His first passive is Hunter's Senses, and this is here to defend him from any threats he might not be aware of. Whenever Kraven gets damaged, the enemy who damaged him is revealed to Kraven in a similar way to how Punisher's vision works on enemies who walk behind walls. So basically the outline of the enemy who damaged him will be visible to Kraven, so he can quickly turn around and see exactly where they're hiding and figure out whether it's worth fighting the guy who's fighting him, taking cover, or ignoring them and continuing with what he was doing. The other passive ability is Feline Perch. This is a limited double jump, where basically if Kraven's next to a wall and he jumps, he can press the jump button again to immediately start ascending that wall. He'll basically jump a second time upwards, directly up. This is to help him get to the exact positions he needs in order to set up for his rifle shots. He can also dash, because he'll still be in the air, so what he could do is jump, use that wall to get a second jump, and then dash from that as well with his pounce ability. But all of this is so that he can build up for his ultimate. Kraven's ultimate being Hunted. Hunted has two steps. So the first step involves his voice line, where he will yell out whatever it is that Kraven wants to yell for his ultimate, and in doing so, similarly to his passive ability, the outline of all of the enemy team are revealed to all of Kraven's team. Immediately after this, he will ready into a stance with his hunting spear, and if you press the attack button, he will throw that hunting spear. Now this hunting spear does not work the same as his normal one. Instead, this one will deal significantly more damage eventually. It starts off with a little bit more damage, and the further it is thrown, the more damage it will deal. So it's like over distance, it increases in damage. The secondary trait of this particular spear throw is it ignores all walls. So when you throw it, it will just fly through them until it hits an enemy, where it will then have the same knockback and pinning effect as his normal hunting spear. This is sort of meant to combo with the first half of this ultimate, so you'd reveal all the enemies, and if you see someone who's a significant distance away, you can throw that spear, and as long as it lands, it's going to pack an intense punch. But a character is not their kit alone. We have the team-up abilities, which is obviously always determined by who's on your team with you. Kraven, much like Doc Ock, gets 2 team-up abilities, one of them being Sinister Trap, which, as I said, I'll explain at the end of the video, and the other one is Last Hunt. Now, Last Hunt is a reference to the comic books, in name and in who he teams up with. So Kraven, when on a game with Punisher or with Venom, activates his team-up ability. Now, Kraven is the anchor for this, so he doesn't innately get anything other than a seasonal bonus, but what Punisher and Venom get are access to the Hunter's Senses passive ability. So for Punisher, this would only be a minor sort of bonus. It means that if someone damages him and then hides before he gets to look at them, he can still see their outline. It's not going to come up as much, but I wanted to throw Punisher in because it's a nice reference to the fact that him and Kraven have faced off in the comics and cartoons before. And then as for Venom, he was thrown in mainly for the fact that whilst he never actually wore the real symbiote, he has wore the Black Spider-Man suit before. And I thought, imagining if that was the symbiote, Venom would then have some of Kraven's abilities. So, in the same sense, Kraven gets access to the passive. Not Kraven, sorry, Venom gets access to the passive, and Venom would use this in order to figure out who's attacking him and reposition himself with his web swing and still see through walls and exactly where that enemy is before he goes in for that dive. And that being said, Kraven, I think it works really well if you pick out exactly who you want to target and then focus on them with your cooldowns, with your rifle. Make sure you get into close range once they're all set up and they have all the negatives for them and finish them off. He'd be really good for picking out the supports that your enemies are trying so desperately to cover and protect, and then trying to get out of that combat and start it all over again. But that brings us to the final member of our Sinister Six for this video. He is one of my personal favourite Sinister Six members, or just Spider-Man villains in general, and he is incredibly impressive when it comes to the threat and power level, given Spider-Man is a friendly neighborhood hero. And on top of all of that, I think he could be the most creative option for this game out of almost any of the villains in Marvel comic books. I think anyone who touches this concept will come out with a completely different idea on how to use him. That, of course, is Sandman.
I don't want to hurt you. Leave now.
I guess you haven't heard. I'm the sheriff around these parts.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Flint Marko, or William Baker, better known as the Sandman, is an iconic and core part of Spider-Man's history, but also a really interesting villain in his own right. Not only is he one of my favourite Marvel villains, but I also think his moveset could make for some of the most creative and intriguing kits in the game. Honestly, I think there's a million ways you could work him into a hero, more so than any other hero currently in the game. His power set is just so malleable, and of course, as you likely figured out by now, he's our first Vanguard in the Sinister Six. And so, I've focused more on giving him longevity and damage mitigation features within his kit. Really, I was inspired by the concept of his sand clones in the video games and that one scene from Spider-Man 3 where Spidey punches right through him. Starting off with his attacks, we're going to focus on one, and that is his big hand. In almost every depiction, I swear he makes a big old fist and just punches Spider-Man in the face. And I wanted to emulate that in his basic attack. Honestly, this would be extremely similar to Groot's primary fire, where he just throws his fists out at enemies. I can imagine it being a bit slower, but having a wider range and dealing a little bit more damage. But honestly, I don't think you need to work on it too much. It could pretty much be the same sort of concept. His primary fire isn't where Sandman is going to reside most of his work. Instead, his cooldowns are really going to define this character. Now, this Sandman doesn't actually have any passives. It's entirely a cooldown-centered kit, and it all revolves around one main ability, Breakaway. So, at the center of his kit is this power, which basically means Sandman can jump backwards, sort of dodge back, and leave behind a clone of himself, a sand clone. Now, these sand clones don't actively do anything on their own, and they visually look pretty much the same as Sandman, except they're entirely made of sand. And they have two distinguishing states. There are standing clones and broken clones. Standing clones have a health bar, which, if it ever reduces to 0, will turn them into a broken clone, and broken clones stay in the game for a short period of time before just despawning. There is no max number of broken clones, but when it comes to standing clones, I would say it would probably be a max of like 2 or 3. Sandman can remove these standing clones at any time he likes, or he can get rid of them by using his other abilities, which we're going to get into just now. His first ability that interacts with the sand clones is Sand Burst. This basically makes the sand clone explode, damaging enemies all around it and turning it into a living bomb. When he uses this ability, the sand clone turns into a broken clone and then eventually disappears because it's a broken clone. But he cannot use this on broken clones. It is solely a standing clone feature. It just kind of works like a manual controlled version of Penny's Mines. So people walking past a sand clone won't cause it to explode, but Sandman can actively make it when he wants it to. He just has to have line of sight to the clone and this ability ready. I'd make all of these cooldowns I'm about to describe pretty much really short, other than maybe the final one, but the idea is he still has to see the clone and know when to press the button. The other interactivity that he has with his clones is Sand Return. Now, this works with both standing and broken clones, but does something different depending on which they are. When he uses this on a full standing clone, he will absorb that standing clone back into himself. Doing so removes any trace of the clone, but gives Sandman a boost of health, healing him. This works really well outside of combat if you need that heal back, or if you're in combat and you're just suddenly losing the fight. Alternatively, he can absorb a broken clone. Doing so doesn't heal Sandman, but it gives him temporary shield or overheal, kind of like how Venom's works. It won't be nearly as much health as Venom's max, but it would be a little bit just to help him tide over in that fight, or if he's just on the retreat and quickly needs something to take the bullets for him. This isn't really a tool he'd likely use outside of combat all that much, but inside of combat this can be the little bit that really turns the flow of the fight. But that brings us on to his final ability, which doesn't actually interact with the sand clones, but is more about that sort of concept of Sandman always being a threat so long as there's a single grain of sand left. And that ability is Last Grain. So this doubles as an active ability and a passive ability. Passive feature is whenever Sandman walks around, he leaves a small trail behind him. Think how Luna Snow has that ice trail whenever she uses her speed forwards. But the active feature is whenever he turns on this ability, he will teleport to the farthest point of that trail. Now, the trail is not determined in length by a set amount of meters or distance. Instead, it would work far more like Magic's discs that she gives to Black Panther and Psylocke, where they go back a set period of time, not distance. So if he stands still for a long time, the trail he leaves behind will look shorter for a bit, but if he's constantly walking, he will look like he has a longer trail. All of this, of course, is to allow Sandman to control the battlefield, try to mitigate as much damage as possible, and do his job as a tank, waiting for his ult to fully build up. His ult, originally I wanted to incorporate that classic boss fight feel, where Sandman's this huge hulking monster, but I couldn't think of anything creative and actually interesting for this build to use. So instead of going down the route of the Hulk, I went down a more interesting take, I personally feel, and that is with the ultimate Sandstorm. Whenever Sandman activates this ability, he transforms into a large storm of sand, and quite similar to Storm's ult, he will have a radius around him, only I imagine it would be a larger radius than Storm's, but he wouldn't have this big tornado in the middle. Instead, it would be more like a big column around the border. All enemies within this radius are blinded in a similar fashion to how Cloak's blindness of power works, and they take chip damage from the sand batting at them. Now, enemies can walk out of this, but you are the storm, so you can move the radius and follow them as they're walking out. If your enemies are splitting up, it's going to be harder to really get this in a good position, but when the enemy team's grouped up, this thing can be a game changer. Now, the chip damage alone probably won't really kill anyone unless they're already significantly injured, but what this does mean is your enemies are taking hits and they're blind, so your teammates can take advantage of this because they can see perfectly fine within the storm and they can finish off the enemies. Then, finally, we have his team-up abilities. Now, there is Sinister Snare, which is his team-up with Kraven and Doc Ock. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first we have his Glass Clone. Now, Glass Clone I've written on the screen here, as you can see, as a team-up ability with the Storm, but honestly, you could write this as a team ability with 4. It really just needs access to lightning. I put it as a team ability with Storm because I think having a Vanguard and Duelist team-up is more interesting than a double Vanguard team-up, and it can come up more often, but either role works perfectly fine. The general idea is when Sandman is next to a broken clone, he can use the team ability button to immediately strike that broken clone with lightning, turning it into a glass broken clone. The only difference here is glass broken clones don't despawn over time, meaning he can guarantee he has that little bit of overheal sat on the battlefield waiting for him. It's nothing too insane, but it's also nothing bad. The ability to make sure your broken clones are hanging around is really useful and can really change how you view broken clones. But if you don't have it, it's not going to make Sandman any weaker per se, it's not going to make him worse. This is just a nice little addition to have to his kit if you have Storm on the team with you. With that being said, let's get on over to the Sinister Six first team ability, the one between Doc Ock, Kraven, and Sandman. So Sinister Snare, or Sinister Trap, or Sinister Designs are team abilities between the 3 characters we've covered in the video. The overall team ability would probably be called Sand Snare. And before I get into the mechanics, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of the lore that would probably be on the sheet if it was added into the game. So, while they were plotting a way to take down Spider-Man, Doc Ock was studying the actual core elements of how Sandman's powers work. And in doing so, he realized he can weaponize Marco's powers. And so he created the Sand Snare, a weapon that he was going to give to Kraven to use as traps in order to catch his prey more easily. Now, of course, Sandman, being the originator of this power, decided he too deserved access to this weapon since it was a part of him. So now, whenever Kraven or Sandman are on a team with Doc Ock, they gain access to the Sand Snare. The way this would work is you'd throw it on the ground, much like a penny mine, and then if an enemy walked over to it, they would be stunned and trapped in sand. This would work just like Penny's web ability or Luna's freeze ability, where it basically just insta-freezes them when they stand over it. It would probably also have the same ult that's preventing powers that those abilities have, only because you're not aiming it and it's an item placed on the ground, that would come up extremely rarely. Generally speaking, it's not meant to be some insane power, it's just a nice bit of kit that lets Kraven have yet another thing to stun people with, and it lets Sandman get people trapped, probably around his clones, so that he can then blow his clones upon them, or just to use when he feels it's necessary in a fight or in controlling the arena, as he's sort of built to do. That being said, that is my first half of the Sinister Six pitched video. The second half we're going to cover very soon on the next video I upload to the channel. But I'd love to hear what you guys want villain-wise, just character-wise in general, and all of that in the comments. You guys did such a great job on my first video about Marvel Rebels, even though the audio was horrendous. I know this isn't too much better. I am looking into getting a nice mic so I can give you guys better audio quality. And I just thank everyone. We hit 100 subscribers as of recording this, and I'm so happy and so thankful for you guys and what you're doing. And I'd love to know what characters or themes or concepts you'd like me to do a pitch video on in the future. The channel won't just be Marvel Rivals pitch videos. For those of you who don't know, this channel is about everything geeky. But I will be doing a few of these still because these seem really fun and you guys seem to really like them. So, what characters do you want in Marvel Rivals? Let me know down below. Let me know your pitches for characters. Let me know the themes and concepts you'd like me to break down. Whether it's the cosmic side of Marvel, Marvel Knights, whether it's more mutants and more X-Men, whether you want villains, anything. Let me know, and I'll give it a go.